Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. Over the weekend, the U.S. captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, and the country faces an uncertain future. I'm joined now by Natasha Lindstaedt. She is a Forbes contributor and also a professor at the University of Essex. She is an expert in authoritarian regimes, and she's been writing on the situation in Venezuela for Forbes. Natasha, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, can you just give us the top line 30-second summary where we are right now? Last night, Trump said that Venezuela would send oil to the US. Maduro is here in New York. Can you give us the broad overview of where we are right now?
Right. So, as you mentioned, Maduro's in New York and he'll face charges and will have to stand trial. And Trump claims that the U.S. is in control of Venezuela, although there is some sort of de facto leadership of Maduro's vice president, Delcy Rodriguez. She claims to be in charge as well. And Trump mentioned that if she doesn't get in line with what he wants her to do, that she will face a fate that's even worse than what Maduro has faced. And Trump has said that he's going to be seizing some 30 to 50 million barrels of oil that could be worth several billion that apparently Venezuela owes the US. But really, there's more unknowns at the moment than knowns. It seems like we don't know who really is in charge of Venezuela, how long the US will be in control, how much is this going to cost, who's going to pay for it, and what the Venezuelan people and military's reaction is going to be.
There are so many subtopics to dive into in what you just said. You have the state of governing in Venezuela right now. You mentioned Delcy Rodriguez. I was listening to reports earlier that indicated that most of Maduro's government, his officials, are still in power and see themselves as the shepherds of the Maduro regime. What has all of this meant, to your understanding, for individual citizens in Venezuela?
Well, I think Venezuela has been dealing with all kinds of hardships. I mean, really since Maduro took over, but even predating that under the final years of Hugo Chavez, they were near state collapse. Venezuela faced almost near state collapse. In 2015, you saw millions of people flee the country. Some 7, 8 million Venezuelans have fled. 90% of the country is living in poverty. Many people really living in abject poverty, not even able to access food. So I think at the moment, they're just feeling a lot of uncertainty. They're just not sure what's going to happen next. Is the US going to come in with ground troops? Is the US going to engage in a bombing campaign? Is the US going to take more greater control over the situation? Or is it really just the same regime in charge, but Maduro has left and will face charges? I mean, with the type of regime that Maduro led, I mean, it was very personalistic, but he really empowered the military by giving them access to all kinds of lucrative business opportunities, mainly in the drug trafficking world. And so the military has a vested interest in keeping the status quo, and it's not going to be easy for them to leave power. And at the moment, they do still hold a lot of power. So for a lot of these Venezuelan citizens, there is a lot of uncertainty as where the future holds.
Another piece of uncertainty, and I don't know if you can comment on this, is Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado. I think one of the questions I had as I watched the developments over the weekend is whether we would see Maria step into power. Have you looked at her, at where she is in the world, if she's going to step into the void?
So I think that's what some people thought was going to happen, that Machado would, and the Democratic opposition would be given the chance to take over. So this is kind of similar to what happened in the case of Panama when it was invaded in 1989 in December by the US. There had been an election in May of that year, and the Democratic candidates that won were able to come to power. But Trump has made clear that Machado is not going to be taking over, neither her or any of the opposition members, and he hasn't really set a timeline of when elections are going to take place. That's what you usually would think would happen if a dictator has been ousted, that there would be some kind of schedule set up or blueprint for when is some kind of democratic transition going to be implemented. But he hasn't made any explanation about this yet, and so we don't really know what's going to happen to Machado.
And as I noted at the top of this conversation, late last night, President Trump did say that Venezuela would be sending oil to the US, roughly 30 to 50 million barrels of oil, according to reports, which could be worth as much as $3 billion. Has Venezuela commented on this? How likely is it that that transaction comes to bear?
I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, thus far, we're getting a bit of mixed signals from the Venezuelan regime. I think from Delcy Rodriguez, she has been trying to say that she's in control, and she's been somewhat defiant of Trump and trying to say that the U.S. and Trump are not controlling Venezuela, and that what has happened is illegal, that this was a kidnapping of Maduro. She's made clear that that's how she feels about this, that she's not going to be pliant. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, he has threatened her. And so we'll see if the rest of the Venezuelan regime remains more quiet. I mean, the thing is that US was able to basically kidnap or extract a leader from its country, and it's possible that the US could just seize this oil, and that there's no one that is going to stop it. I mean, the US is also in the middle of some kind of like cat and mouse chase between the US and Russia, because there is this oil tanker that the US is pursuing, and Russia has recently sent over its naval force to try to stop this. So the US is really pushing things to the brink in its quest to gain more access of Venezuelan oil. And of course, Venezuela traded oil significantly with some of these countries that face sanctions, in addition to itself, but also with Iran and Russia. And we're not really sure how this is going to play out.
What's your sense of how this could impact global relations? I'm asking because China last night criticized President Trump's claim that Venezuela would be sending oil to the US, calling it, quote, a classic act of bullying. Is this, are the events of the past few days something that could alter the world order? That sounds dramatic, but given the power players at hand, I do have to ask.
Oh, definitely. I mean, we see that when the US invaded Iraq in 2003, this emboldened Russia to invade Georgia in 2008, and then later Ukraine in 2014, and of course again in 2022. That the actions of a hegemon, and particularly if it's a democratic hegemon like the US, are going to have a huge impact on the rest of the world. And when the US is at its most democratic, the rest of the world is at its most democratic and at its most peaceful. When the US is engaging in behavior that some might argue is imperialistic, this is going to embolden autocrats to engage in similar types of behavior. So, I mean, the concern with China, of course, is when is it going to invade Taiwan? I don't think it's a question of if, but when. And without really anyone to stop the US from invading Venezuela, I think Xi Jinping sees that this is really the time to invade Taiwan, and we may see more aggressive imperialistic behavior of other powerful autocracies. And we also see that the US was key to upholding the post-World War II global order alongside its allies in Europe. And it's not just its attack on Venezuela that's a concern, but it's also the claims from some in the Trump administration, like Stephen Miller, that the US is going to seize Greenland. And the Prime Minister of Denmark, Mette Frederiksen, has already said if the US does this, this is going to really be the end of NATO. So we're at a really important inflection point right now. There's a lot happening, and it's not certain how the world or what the world can do in reaction to what Trump has done. But the impression is that he has gone rogue, and there's very little that can be done to stop him.
Now, Natasha, in December, you wrote a story for Forbes.com with the headline, Why Pursuing Regime Change in Venezuela Will Be a Disaster. I don't think you've used that word in this conversation, but is that still a headline and a stance that you stand by?
So I definitely stand by the idea that pursuing regime change in Venezuela is a mistake. If we were to make the comparison between, the U.S. invasion in Iraq, I don't see this invasion of Venezuela being as costly, as deadly, as dangerous. I mean, that ended up spawning the Islamic State, creating, all kinds of instability in the Middle East. But I don't think that the invasion of Venezuela is going to be as smooth as the invasion of Panama, for example, which in itself, there were problems in the aftermath. There was looting, there was crime, there was a preponderance of U.S. force used, and several hundred Panamanians died in that effort. Um, Operation Just Cause. In the case of Venezuela, I mean, I think we have to really look out for the fact that, it has 28 million people, many of whom are impoverished, as I already mentioned. And there are violent non-state groups that operate, with impunity in Venezuela, particularly the ELN, which is a guerrilla group that operates on the borders of Colombia and Venezuela, has all kinds of guerrilla war experience, and is involved in the drug trade. And then you also have the military, which is not a drug cartel, but has members of the military that are working with drug traffickers. And we refer to this sort of loose network as Cartel de los Solos. And then you also have the colectivos, which are citizens who had been working with the Maduro regime, and were really loyal to the Bolivarian revolution and the ideals of Chavez, and Maduro, this sort of socialist ideals. And so there could be pushback. I mean, at the moment, we are not hearing reports of great levels of instability, but there could be a reaction to this, that we may be members of the military that are not going to be in line with whatever new regime is out there if they feel that they're not benefiting as much, if the lucrative business opportunities are not there. And you already had a country that faced incredibly high levels of crime, some of the highest homicide rates in the world, a lot of guns in circulation, and a lot of gangs and criminality. So I think without proper planning, this really could be a disaster still.
Now, Natasha, in the story that you published this week, you wrote there's a section that's really interesting about the advantages of choosing a life in exile. So Maduro was detained by US authorities. That choice effectively is gone for him, correct?
That's right.
But if he had chosen it, if he had chosen to flee, if he had chosen a life in exile, you point to research that indicate that, he could have had a nice life, possibly even go on to other dictatorships, according to history, looking at other dictators. Can you explain this?
Right. So most dictators that choose a life in exile, they will go off to another dictatorship. I mean, that's really the only type of country that will welcome them. And if they go to countries such as Russia or Saudi Arabia, they often live a life of luxury. I mean, we can see this with the case of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. He fled to Moscow, and I'm sure he's living very comfortably there. Leaders like Idi Amin of Uganda, he fled to Saudi Arabia, where he was hosted. So did Tunisia's Ben Ali fled to Saudi Arabia, and they lived, really, really nicely, very luxuriously. Idi Amin's case, he was living in a hotel, and he had all the amenities that he needed. And by choosing a life of exile, they avoid jail time. So they may not be, holding the amount of political power that they did in the past, but they don't wind up in prison or even worse, dead.
Do we know? It's hard to know anyone's internal motivations. I should hedge this question with that caveat. But do we know why Maduro chose to stay in country and not flee if he had the opportunity to do so within the previous weeks and months?
So the reports were saying that Maduro just didn't believe that Trump was going to attack, that he believed that Trump was bluffing. We saw videos of him dancing and that he wasn't really taking it very seriously. He was trying to negotiate with Trump, reportedly in that November 21st phone call that they had, that he could leave the country, but then still be in charge of the military, and that Delcy Rodriguez would be the basically like the de facto leader of the country. But that wasn't really enough for Trump, and you still had Maduro thinking, even up until the last day before he was kidnapped, that they were still going to have a chance to meet. So what I think happened in this case is Maduro just didn't believe that Trump was seriously going to get rid of him.
There remain so many questions, both for what this means for the US, what it means for the global order, what it means for citizens of Venezuela. We've kind of hit on all of them, but as we move forward in January, in the coming days and weeks, Natasha, what will you be looking at the most? What will you be paying attention to? And what are the questions you will be asking?
I'm mostly interested in whether the military accepts this new normal, whether or not there is some kind of obvious signs that there's some defections taking place, the military taking matters into their own hands, or whether we see the rise of violent groups. I mean, I think in the worst case scenario, you're going to see drug trafficking groups congregate more in Venezuela, thinking that there is a vacuum. And that they can benefit from the chaos and uncertainty. I'm also looking to see what happens with the opposition forces in Venezuela to see if they start organizing and start pressuring for democratic elections to take place. And then the final thing would be to look at what happens with the relationship between Trump and Delcy Rodriguez. If they're able to maintain some kind of cordiality, then I think what you really had here is just a leadership change and really not any kind of regime change at all.
Natasha, thank you so much for joining us this morning. And for folks who want to read her work, please look for her on Forbes.com. She is Natasha Lindstaedt, professor at University of Essex and expert in authoritarian regimes. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.